August 14th, 1943. A stretch of sun-blasted earth, somewhere in the Arizona desert, designated by the U.S. Army as Proving Ground Sector Gamma 7. The air doesn't move. It hangs heavy and hot, thick with the smell of creosote and baking dust. You can feel the sun on your eyelids even when they're closed. This is where Major Arthur Sterling, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, is building his legacy, one concrete bunker and brick revetment at a time. He stands with his hands on his hips, a crisp khaki uniform already showing dark patches of sweat under the arms and at the collar. His face is a mask of focused impatience, eyes squinting against the glare as he surveys the worksite. All around him is the noise of progress, the grinding cough of a generator, the rhythmic clang of hammers on steel pegs, the shouts of young soldiers in dusty fatigues, their movements sluggish in the oppressive heat. They are building walls designed to fail, walls whose destruction will be meticulously documented to teach the Army how better to destroy the walls of their enemies in Europe and the Pacific. A cloud of dust on the horizon resolves into a sputtering Ford flatbed truck. It rattles to a halt near Sterling's command tent, and from its bed, a half-dozen older Native American men disembark. They are Hopi, from the mesas a day's journey north. They are the local labor, hired for their reputed hardiness and knowledge of the land, though Sterling sees them mostly as cheap muscle for hauling sandbags and digging trenches. He watches them, his expression unreadable. They move with a quiet economy of motion that seems to defy the heat, their dark eyes taking in the chaotic military scene. Their leader, a man named Lomahongva, approaches Sterling. He is not tall, but he carries himself with an unshakable stillness. His face is a topography of deep lines carved by decades of sun and wind, his long gray hair tied back with a simple leather cord. He doesn't offer a handshake, just a slight nod. "Major." His voice is low and gravelly, like stones tumbling in a dry wash. Sterling nods back, curtly. "Lomahongva, you and your men are on the east perimeter. Sergeant Miller will show you. We're laying the foundations for the primary target structure. Standard rebar and poured concrete." He gestures with a thumb towards a maze of wooden forms and steel rods, baking in the sun. Lomahongva looks at the structure, then back at Sterling. He lets a moment of silence pass, a silence that seems to make the Major uncomfortable. "This wall," he says, his gaze sweeping over the blueprints pinned to a folding table, weighed down at the corners with rocks, "it is to be shot with cannons." "That's the idea," Sterling replies, a hint of condescension in his tone. "We test our fortifications to find their breaking point. Then we test our ordnance to make sure it can get the job done. This one," he taps the blueprint for a 10-foot-high brick wall, "is a simulation of a standard European factory enclosure. Reinforced mortar joints, double-withed brick." Lomahongva studies the intricate drawing, the precise lines and measurements, the chemical specifications for the mortar mix. He runs a calloused finger over the paper, then looks out at the piles of reddish-brown sandstone that have been bulldozed clear of the construction sites. He turns back to the Major, his expression placid. "This wall," he says, "will break. It is not a question or a guess. It is a statement of fact." A smirk plays on Sterling's lips. "That's the point, old man. We want to see how it breaks. We film it. We analyze the fragmentation patterns, the spalling, the blast radius." He trails off, realizing the technical jargon is likely lost on the old Hopi. Lomahongva's eyes, however, are sharp and intelligent. "It will shatter," he clarifies, "like glass. The hard poison you mix with the sand and water. It holds the bricks together too tightly. It makes them one solid thing. When the cannon hits, the shock has nowhere to go. The whole wall dies at once." Sterling's smirk fades into a frown of annoyance. He isn't here for a lecture on primitive engineering from a man who lives in a mud house on a cliff. Our methods are based on decades of engineering science, thank you very much. They have built the skyscrapers of New York and the dams of the Colorado River. Skyscrapers do not get shot with cannons, Lomahongva replies, his voice even. He gestures again to the piles of discarded native stone. We have stone. Let us build you a wall, the way our ancestors did. The other Hopi men have stopped their work, watching the exchange. A few of the younger soldiers have paused as well, leaning on their shovels, curious. The proposition hangs in the shimmering air. Sterling almost laughs. With what? Mud? You want to build a mud and stick wall to stop a 75mm shell? No mud, Lomahongva says patiently. Only stone. Dry stone. No poison in the joints. The major stares at him, baffled. A dry stack wall? You mean just a pile of rocks? I'm not building a farmer's fence here. This is a military installation. A farmer's fence keeps in the sheep, Lomahongva says. A flicker of something, amusement perhaps, in his eyes. A Hopi wall keeps out the world. He looks Sterling directly in the eye, his gaze unwavering. Let us build our wall next to yours. Use your cannon on both. The audacity of the proposal is staggering. Here, in the heart of the U.S. military's scientific industrial complex, an old Indian is challenging the very foundations of modern engineering with a technique that predates the written word. It's absurd. It's laughable. And yet, there's a deadline. There's a visiting general coming in 2 weeks. And Sterling, for all his by-the-book rigidity, has a sliver of professional curiosity. What harm could it do? It would be a useful demonstration of primitive folly, a good laugh for the men. Fine, Sterling says the words, snapping in the heat. Fine. You want to build your rock pile? Go ahead. There's a clear plot right next to the primary target. 10 feet high, 4 feet thick. Same dimensions as the brick wall. You use whatever rocks you can find. My engineers will have the brick wall up in 3 days. Let's see how long your little project takes. He turns away, dismissing Lomahongva and his proposal as a sideshow. He can already hear the jokes from the other officers. As Lomahongva walks back to his men, a young corporal with a speed graphic camera hanging from his neck, Corporal Miller, the unit photographer, watches him go. He sees the quiet dignity in the old man's walk, the certainty in his posture. He looks at the perfect, rigid lines on the engineer's blueprints, and then at the chaotic, organic pile of sandstone under the desert sun. For the first time, he feels a sliver of doubt, a quiet question mark, hanging in the oppressive, silent heat of Sector Gamma 7. The work began the next morning, before the sun had crested the eastern mesas and turned the desert floor into a furnace. The two construction sites, situated 50 yards apart, could have been on different planets. On Major Sterling's plot, the scene was one of ordered, mechanical industry. A team of Army engineers, working from the precise blueprints, laid out the brick wall's foundation with transits and plumb lines. The air filled with the scrape of trowels, the wet slap of mortar, and the shouted commands of a young lieutenant ticking off checklists on a clipboard. Pallets of identical, red clay bricks were unloaded. Bags of Portland cement were ripped open, their gray powder billowing into the air to mix with the dust. A gasoline-powered mixer churned a constant, gritty slurry of sand, water, and cement. It was a process of uniformity and brute force. Each brick was a perfect soldier, placed in a rigid line, bound to its neighbors by the unyielding grip of modern chemistry. The wall rose swiftly, a testament to efficiency, a sheer, flat plane of perfect geometry against the rugged landscape. Major Sterling would stop by twice a day, folding his arms and nodding in satisfaction. This was strength. This was control. This was how you built something to last. Or in this case, something to be destroyed in a predictable, scientifically measurable way. 50 yards away, a different kind of construction was taking place, governed by a different set of laws. There were no blueprints, no levels, no plumb lines. There was only Lomahongva, his small crew of Hopi men, and the sprawling field of sandstone rubble. They did not begin by building. They began by walking. For hours, under the rising sun, they moved slowly among the piles of stone. They were not just looking. They were listening, feeling, understanding. Lomahongva would pick up a stone, turn it over and over in his weathered hands, feeling its weight, its balance, its texture. He'd tap it with a knuckle, listening to the tone it produced. He was reading the story of each rock, where it had come from, how it had been broken from the mother ledge, where its internal stresses lay. He was searching for its spirit, its place in the whole. Corporal Miller, tasked with documenting all construction, found himself drawn to the Hopi site. At first, his photographs were of the army wall, dynamic shots of soldiers at work, the crisp lines, the sense of military purpose. But the quiet intensity of the Hopi drew his lens. He watched as Lomahongva finally selected a large, flat-bottomed stone and with 2 other men carried it to the designated spot. This was the foundation, the cornerstone. From there, the process was like a slow, intricate dance. The men would bring Lomahongva stones, and he would either accept them with a nod or reject them with a slight shake of his head, sending the man back to search for another. Each chosen stone was placed with painstaking care. There was no mortar, no binding agent. The only tools were gravity, friction, and 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge. They were not stacking bricks, they were weaving stone. Miller watched, mesmerized, as Lomahongva fitted a jagged, triangular piece into a gap between 2 larger stones with a precision that seemed impossible. It slid into place with a soft, grinding sigh, locking its neighbors together. He was using the irregularities of the stones, not fighting them. A bulge in one rock would nestle perfectly into a hollow in another. He used long, flat tie stones that reached deep into the wall's core, stitching the outer faces together. The wall grew not in straight, predictable lines, but organically. It had a slight curve, a batter, a gentle slope inwards as it rose. It was thick at the base and tapered towards the top. It looked less like a man-made structure and more like a natural geologic formation, something that had been pushed up from the earth itself. The soldiers, on their breaks, would wander over to watch, their amusement plain. "Hey, Joe, think that'll stop a tank?" one would shout, getting a laugh from his buddies. "Looks like my grandpa's garden wall." They saw a crude pile of rocks. They didn't see the interlocking patterns, the way each stone rested on at least 3 others below it, distributing its weight. They didn't see the tiny gaps and spaces, the breathing room that Lomahongva was deliberately leaving between the stones. To them, it was sloppy, primitive. Major Sterling shared their assessment, though he kept it to himself. He saw a lack of discipline, a disregard for precision. "There's no structural integrity," he muttered to his lieutenant one afternoon, watching the Hopi work. "No tensile strength. The moment a shell hits, the kinetic shock will knock those loose stones out like bowling pins. It'll collapse into a heap." The lieutenant nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. It's just a gravity pile. Basic physics." But Corporal Miller saw something else. Through his camera's viewfinder, he framed a shot of Lomahongva's face, beaded with sweat. His eyes narrowed in absolute concentration as he used a smaller rock, a shim, to adjust the angle of a massive boulder by a fraction of an inch. It wasn't a lack of precision. It was a different kind of precision. It was intuitive, tactile, a conversation between the man and the material. His photos from the army site were all sharp angles and hard shadows. His photos of the Hopi wall were about texture, curves, and the interplay of light on 1,000 different surfaces. One was a monument to order. The other was a testament to harmony. In 4 days, the army's brick wall was finished, capped, cured, and ready for destruction. A perfect, blood-red rectangle sitting on the desert floor. It took the Hopi men 7 days. When they were done, Lomahongva walked the length of his creation, his hand trailing along the rough, uneven surface. It was not perfect. It was not uniform. And yet, it was whole. It looked ancient, rooted, as if it had stood in that spot for centuries. As the Hopi crew packed their tools, Sterling strode over. "Finished with your rock garden, Lomahongva?" The old Hopi looked at his wall, then at the major. He said, "Our work is done. The stone will do the rest." Sterling shook his head and chuckled, turning back towards his own flawless, rigid, and perfectly engineered wall. The stage was set. The test was scheduled for the following Monday. The weekend before the test was a time of strange quiet. The roar of the generators fell silent. The clang of hammers ceased. A skeleton crew remained on base, and the oppressive desert heat seemed to reclaim the territory, pressing down on the 2 silent walls standing starkly against the infinite blue sky. They were more than just test subjects now. They were monuments to 2 different worlds, 2 opposing philosophies, separated by 50 yards of cracked earth. The Army's brick wall was an object of professional pride for Major Sterling and his men. It was flawless. Its lines were so straight they seemed to cut into the horizon. The mortar joints were clean and precise, each one a perfect gray stripe against the uniform red of the bricks. It was the very picture of modern, man-made strength. It radiated rigidity. It dared you to find a flaw in its construction. It was a statement of certainty. The Hopi wall was something else entirely. It did not stand in defiance of the landscape. It seemed to be a part of it. The varied colors of the sandstone, from deep ochre to pale tan, blended with the desert floor. Its surface was a complex tapestry of shapes and shadows that shifted with the sun's passage. It had what Corporal Miller, struggling to describe it in a letter home, called character. It looked alive. It possessed a kind of quiet, patient strength, the strength of a mountain that has endured millennia of wind and rain. It did not dare you to strike it. It simply was, and it gave the impression that it would simply be, long after everything else had turned to dust. On Saturday evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the western sky, Miller saw a lone figure walking out toward the Hopi wall. It was Lomahongva. He hadn't left with the other workers. Miller grabbed his speed graphic, his photographer's instincts kicking in, and followed at a distance, using the deepening shadows for cover. He watched as the old man approached the wall he had built. There was no grand ceremony. Lomahongva simply placed both of his palms flat against the stone, closed his eyes, and stood there for a long time, motionless. His lips moved, but the words were too quiet for Miller to hear, carried away by the first cool whisper of the evening breeze. He wasn't praying to the wall. It seemed more like he was speaking with it, reminding it of its nature, of the strength that lay not in resistance but in unity and flexibility. He took a small pouch from his belt, and from it he sprinkled a fine yellow powder, corn pollen, Miller guessed, at the base of the wall, an offering, a blessing. It was a moment of such profound and simple reverence that Miller felt like an intruder. He lowered his camera without taking a picture. Some things were not meant to be captured on film.
Later that night, the mood in the officers' tent was jovial. Major Sterling was holding court, a bottle of government-issue whiskey making the rounds. The coming test was the main topic of conversation. "I'll give the old man's rock pile one thing," a young captain laughed. "It'll make for a spectacular pile of rubble, much more dramatic than the brick." Sterling swirled the whiskey in his tin cup. "It's a valuable lesson in controlled variables," he said, taking on the tone of a lecturer. "We have a baseline target, our wall, built to spec, representing known structural properties, and then we have the aboriginal anomaly, an uncontrolled, unscientific assembly. The data we get from its failure will be, if nothing else, a useful footnote on why we don't build fortifications like Neolithic farmers." They laughed. The jokes wrote themselves. They laid bets on how many shots it would take to completely level the Hopi wall. No one bet higher than 2. Most settled on 1. It was a foregone conclusion. The only question was the margin of victory for modern science. Corporal Miller sat outside the tent, cleaning the lens of his camera, listening to the officers' laughter. He looked out into the moonlit darkness where the 2 walls stood like silent sentinels. He had spent the day processing his photos. In the stark black and white of the chemical bath, the differences between the structures were even more pronounced. The brick wall was all hard lines and flat, lifeless surfaces. The Hopi wall was a universe of texture and detail, each stone a character in a larger story. He thought of Lomahongva's quiet blessing. He thought of the smug confidence in the tent. He looked at the heavy, steel bulk of the M3 75mm pack howitzer parked nearby, its barrel covered with a canvas shroud, waiting for morning. The weapon was a product of the same world as the brick wall, a world of precise calculations, explosive chemistry, and overwhelming force. It was a world that had no room for blessings, for conversations with stone. And yet, for the second time, Miller felt that persistent, nagging sliver of doubt, a sense that everyone, from Major Sterling down to the lowest private, was missing something fundamental. He didn't know what it was, but he had a feeling they were all about to find out. The desert was utterly silent now, holding its breath before the violence of the dawn.
August 21st, 1943. 0800 hours. The sun was already a merciless hammer in the sky. The air, still cool from the night, was rapidly heating up, promising another day of scorching temperatures. There was a buzz of anticipation in Sector Gamma 7 that had nothing to do with the heat. A delegation of ordnance officers had arrived from headquarters, their staff cars kicking up plumes of dust. Major Sterling, looking sharp and authoritative, was giving them a tour. Corporal Miller was in position on a small, purpose-built observation tower, his speed graphic camera ready, a box of fresh film plates beside him. A second motion picture camera crew was set up nearby, their hand-cranked IMO camera aimed and ready to capture the destruction for posterity and analysis. The target for the morning was Target A, the brick wall. It stood 50 yards from the firing line, a proud, defiant slab of red against the brown desert. Through his telephoto lens, Miller could see the perfect clean lines, the sheer artificiality of it. It looked strong. It looked invincible. The gun crew of the M3 pack howitzer worked with a practiced, almost balletic efficiency. The gun, a squat and powerful piece of artillery, was dug in, its trail spades biting deep into the hard-packed earth. The gunner, a sergeant with a wad of chewing tobacco in his cheek, squinted through the direct-fire sight, his hands making minute adjustments to the traverse and elevation wheels. The loader stood ready, a 75mm high-explosive shell cradled in his arms. The shell itself was a marvel of destructive engineering,
a sleek, brass-cased projectile filled with 1.5 pounds of TNT and fitted with a sensitive, point-detonating fuse. Major Sterling's voice cut through the air, amplified by a small, crackling loudspeaker. "All personnel, take cover. Firing demonstration will commence in 2 minutes." The observers ducked behind a thick concrete bunker. Miller hunkered down behind the sandbag parapet of his tower, his camera aimed, his finger ready on the shutter release. The world seemed to shrink down to the space between his lens and the target. The desert went quiet again, the only sound the faint, hot wind and the creak of the howitzer's elevating gear. "Gun ready," the crew chief yelled. Sterling gave the signal. "On target Alpha. Fire." The command was followed by a moment of absolute stillness, and then the world erupted. The howitzer bucked back with a violent, deafening crack that was more felt than heard, a physical punch to the chest. A cloud of dust and gray smoke billowed from the muzzle, and the shell was gone, a flicker too fast for the eye to follow. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The brick wall just stood there, serene and untouched. Then a bright orange flash appeared on its face, exactly center mass. Miller flinched instinctively, but his finger squeezed the shutter release. The sound of the impact arrived a heartbeat after the flash. A sharp, brutal smack, followed immediately by a deeper, shattering crumph. It was exactly as Lomahongva had predicted. The wall didn't just break, it detonated. The force of the TNT, transmitted through the rigid structure by the unyielding mortar, found no release. The entire wall became a brittle shell, and it failed catastrophically. An 8-foot-wide section simply vanished, vaporized into a cloud of red dust and brick shrapnel. Large chunks of the wall, some of the size of a man's torso, were thrown backwards and sideways, tumbling end over end for dozens of feet. The shock wave radiated outwards, creating a perfect starburst of cracks across the remaining sections. What was left was a ruin. A gaping, jagged hole stood where the center of the wall had been, the edges crumbling, the entire structure sagging, broken, and defeated. It was a picture of total, unmitigated destruction. A cheer went up from some of the younger soldiers. The ordnance officers behind the bunker murmured in appreciation, nodding and making notes. The gun had performed perfectly. The target had responded exactly as their engineering models had forecast. Major Sterling allowed himself a small, tight smile of satisfaction. He raised the loudspeaker again. "Cease fire. Damage assessment team, move forward. Observers, stand fast." As 2 engineers with measuring tapes and clipboards trotted out toward the smoking ruin, Sterling's eyes drifted 50 yards to the side, to target B. The Hopi wall, the pile of rocks. It stood there, quiet and unassuming, bathed in the same harsh sunlight, its rough textured face seeming to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Sterling looked at the shattered remains of his own wall, a testament to the awesome power of modern weaponry. Then he looked at the pile of rocks. The contrast was almost comical. He picked up his field radio to give the order to the gun crew. "Traverse right, 20 degrees, new target, target Bravo." The gunner began turning the traverse wheel, the howitzer's barrel swinging slowly, deliberately, until it pointed directly at the heart of Lomahongva's ancient, hand-built wall. The absurdity of it all struck Sterling again. This part of the test felt less like science and more like pest control. The gun crew reloaded. The heavy breech block of the howitzer clanged shut on another 75mm high-explosive shell. The mood on the firing line had shifted. The tension of the first shot was gone, replaced by a casual, almost bored confidence.
They had seen what the gun could do to a professionally built brick wall. This next part was just for show, a bit of fun before breaking for lunch. The visiting officers behind the bunker were talking amongst themselves, some already starting to pack their briefcases. They had seen what they came to see. From his perch, Corporal Miller swapped out his film plate, his hands moving with practiced speed. He centered the viewfinder on the Hopi wall. Unlike the brick wall, its uneven surface made it difficult to find a perfect aiming point. It seemed to swallow the crosshairs. It had no center. It was just a presence. Major Sterling's voice came over the loudspeaker again, this time with an edge of finality, of wrapping up loose ends. On target Bravo, fire. The howitzer roared again, another gut punch of sound and fury. The shell screamed across the 50-yard gap. Miller held his breath, his finger tight on the shutter. This time he watched the wall, not the flash. The shell struck the wall about halfway up, slightly to the left of center. The point detonation fuse worked perfectly. There was the same bright orange flash of detonating TNT, the same sharp smack of impact. But what happened next was wrong. It was impossible. It defied every law of physics Major Sterling had ever learned. The wall did not shatter. It did not explode. It did not break. It moved. For a single surreal moment, the entire structure seemed to turn to liquid. A visible ripple, a shock wave, flowed through the stone like a wave in a pond. The wall shuddered. It groaned. It yielded. The individual stones ground against each other, shifting and resettling with a deep guttural roar that was completely different from the sharp crack of shattering brick. A huge cloud of dust, not the red powder of pulverized brick, but the pale, gritty dust from between the stones, puffed out from the entire face of the wall, as if it had taken a deep breath and exhaled. A few smaller stones on the outer face were blasted loose, skittering across the desert floor. The shell itself, its explosive force spent, had carved out a shallow crater, perhaps a foot deep. But that was all. The wall held, scarred, dusted, and vibrating with the memory of the impact, but standing, whole. A profound, absolute silence fell over Sector Gamma 7. The gun crew stared, their mouths agape. The loader, who had been reaching for another shell, froze in place. Behind the bunker, the ordnance officers were on their feet, binoculars pressed to their eyes, their casual conversation forgotten. Major Sterling stood as if turned to stone himself, the loudspeaker hanging limply from his hand. His mind raced, trying to process what he had just seen. Tensile strength, mortar bonds, structural integrity, all his familiar concepts were useless. They didn't apply here. It was like watching a boxer punch a pillow. The force was simply swallowed. "Fire again," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He raised the loudspeaker, his voice now tight with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "Fire again! Same target!" The gun crew, jolted out of their stupor, scrambled to reload. Another shell slammed into the breach. Fire! The howitzer crashed back a third time. The shell struck the wall just a few feet from the first impact. The result was the same. Another ripple, another deep grinding groan, another great exhalation of dust. The shallow crater was widened. A few more facing stones were knocked away. But the wall's essential integrity was untouched. The force of the explosion didn't find a rigid plane to shatter. Instead, it was dissipated, broken up and absorbed by the thousands of individual stones. Each one shifted slightly, transferring the energy to its neighbors, the friction and movement turning the shell's violent kinetic punch into harmless heat and sound. The tiny gaps between the stones, the breathing room that Sterling had mocked, acted as 1,000 tiny shock absorbers. The wall hadn't resisted the blast. It had danced with it.
Sterling grabbed the field glasses from his aide. He stared at the wall, at the two ugly black smudges on its face. It was still standing. It was taunting him. His perfect scientific brick wall was a pile of rubble after one shot. This pile of rocks had eaten two high-explosive shells and was still standing there. His face was flushed, a mixture of humiliation and dawning, terrifying respect. He looked over at the observation tower and saw Corporal Miller frantically changing film plates, his face alight with the thrill of capturing the impossible. Then Sterling's gaze drifted to the edge of the perimeter, where a lone figure stood watching, silhouetted against the morning sun. It was Lomahongva. He was just standing there, his arms folded, a silent witness to his ancestral knowledge being pitted against the greatest military power on Earth. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. His expression was as serene and unreadable as the stones themselves. "Shoot again!" he cried. "Same target!"
"Ceasefire," Sterling finally croaked into the radio, his voice strained. "Cease fire." The order was unnecessary. The gun crew was already standing by their weapon, simply staring at the Hopi wall, their earlier swagger completely gone, replaced by a quiet awe. The test was over. The silence that descended once more was heavier than before, filled with the weight of overturned assumptions. The visiting ordnance officers were now clustered together, speaking in low, urgent tones, pointing at the wall. Their entire understanding of ballistics and fortifications had just been challenged by a pile of rocks. Without a word to anyone, Major Sterling started walking. He left the command bunker, crossed the firing line, and walked out onto the scorched earth of the impact zone. He didn't head for the ruin of his brick wall. He ignored it as if it didn't exist. He walked directly toward Target Bravo. His men watched him go, a silent procession of eyes following their commander. As he got closer, the scale of what the wall had withstood became clearer. The ground in front of it was littered with the small, dislodged facing stones and sharp, twisted fragments of shell casing. The two impact craters were like ugly sores on the wall's surface, blackened by cordite, but they were shockingly superficial. He reached out and touched the stone around the blast site. It was warm. He could feel a faint vibration still humming deep within the massive structure. He ran his hand over the rough, interlocking stones. He saw now what he had been blind to before. It wasn't a random pile. It was a system, a complex, interconnected system where every piece had a purpose. He pushed against one of the large stones near the crater. It wiggled slightly under his weight, grinding against its neighbors, and then settled firmly back into place. It wasn't weak. It was flexible, resilient. His own wall had been strong like glass, hard, rigid, and ultimately brittle. This wall was strong like leather. It yielded, it absorbed, it endured. He finally understood. The mortar in his wall had been its greatest weakness. It had bound the bricks into a single, rigid ego, forcing them to face the blow as one. When that ego was shattered, the entire structure died. Lomahongva's wall had no ego. It was a community of stones. When the blow came, the community shared the burden. The shock was distributed, passed from stone to stone, until its terrible energy was spent. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Corporal Miller, camera in hand, his face flushed with excitement. "Sir, I've never seen anything like it. Did you see the way it moved?" Sterling just nodded, his eyes still fixed on the wall. "Get pictures of this, Corporal," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of his usual command authority. "Close-ups. Show the impact points. Show the way the stones are fitted together. Document everything." He looked past Miller and saw Lomahongva walking slowly toward them from the perimeter. The old man stopped a few feet away, his gaze resting on the scarred but standing wall, a look of quiet affirmation on his face. Sterling turned to face him. The major, the engineer, the man of science and numbers looked at the old Hopi stonemason. The arrogance was gone from his face, replaced by a deep, grudging, and profound respect. There was no need for apologies or grand pronouncements. The evidence was there, written in stone and steel. "How?" Sterling asked, the single word encompassing a universe of questions. "How did you know?" Lomahongva looked at the wall, then at the major. "We do not fight the rock. We do not fight the force that comes against it. We listen. The stone teaches us how it wants to lie. The cannon teaches the stone how it must move. A wall that cannot breathe is already dead. Your wall held its breath. Ours knew to exhale." In the weeks that followed, Sector Gamma 7 became a different kind of place. Engineers and physicists from across the country were flown in to study Target Bravo. They arrived with their calipers and seismographs, trying to quantify the ancient magic they had witnessed. Their reports would eventually be filled with terms like energy dissipation, dynamic loading, and non-rigid matrix, technical jargon that attempted to explain the simple, profound wisdom that Lomahongva had expressed. The story of the Hopi wall that defeated a cannon became a quiet legend within the Army Corps of Engineers, a cautionary tale about the arrogance of assuming that new is always better, and that science has all the answers. Corporal Miller's photographs, stark and beautiful, became the primary evidence. They showed the impossible, an ancient technique meeting a modern threat and winning not through superior force, but through superior understanding. The image of the wall rippling, exhaling dust under the impact of the shell would become one of his most famous. It was a picture, not of destruction, but of survival, a testament to the enduring strength found not in rigidity, but in the wisdom to yield, to adapt, and to stand together.